The longer an EU member, the more pro-EU, or the other way around? Well, turns out it is not that simple. This video will show you why. The European Union has come a long way since its beginnings as the European Coal and Steel Community in 1951. What started as a small group of 6 countries has developed into a political and economic union with far broader responsibilities and a more diverse membership. The largest enlargement occurred in 2004 when 10 Central and Eastern European states joined. This enlargement is also known as the Eastern Enlargement. In the 20 years that followed, these countries saw massive economic growth, with large-scale infrastructure projects and rising wages. Additionally, EU membership gave approximately 75 million new EU citizens the freedom to easily travel, move, work or study elsewhere in the Union. In older member states, on the other hand, it is only older generations that might have experienced the switch from non-EU to EU membership, or the ECSC, as it was called back then. Could it then be that citizens and politicians in those older member states tend to take the benefits of EU membership for granted? Could they have turned underappreciative of the EU over time? Or could the reverse be true, namely that EU membership causes EU values to ingrain themselves into a country's consciousness over time? In other words, did it make citizens in these countries more appreciative? With Euroscepticism having become more and more common in European politics over the past 2 decades, both in older and newer member states, this raises an important question. Do citizens in the founding member states view the EU differently than those in newer Central Eastern member states? For this video, we compared the Netherlands, a founding member, with Czechia, which joined as part of the Eastern Enlargement in 2004. Despite attitudes towards the EU being vastly different among new member states and among old member states, the Netherlands and Czechia are still interesting to compare. Firstly, because both countries had national elections in October of 2025, giving us a good look at current discourse about the EU. And secondly, the Czech Republic shares its post-communist trajectory with other Eastern Enlargement states such as Poland, Hungary, and the Baltic countries. These states underwent decades of communist rule, transitioned to market economies in the 1990s, and experienced rapid growth following EU accession. The Czech Republic is a prime example of this broader Central Eastern European transition. It is sometimes referred to as the European economic tiger, with its GDP per capita rising from 70% of the EU average before joining to 90% by the late 2010s. You could argue that they reaped the benefits of membership like no other Eastern Enlargement state. The Netherlands, by contrast, similar to other early members like France and Germany, has long been wealthy and deeply embedded in European cooperation. Its early embrace of European integration was shaped by post-war recovery, economic interdependence, and an international outlook grounded in centuries of trade. Given these different histories, one might expect equally distinct attitudes toward the EU. But is that really the case? Let's dive in. First, a quick look at Czechia. In 1989, they overthrew their totalitarian government quite remarkably without any casualties. Soon after this Velvet Revolution, Czechoslovakia expressed interest in joining the European communities. After the split of Czechoslovakia, again, remarkably without any casualties, the newly formed Czech Republic directly began the demanding accession process, adopting EU law, reforming its institutions, and rebuilding much of its governance framework. Public support for accession in the early 2000s was overwhelmingly positive. EU membership was seen as a path to modernization, economic opportunity, and a return to Europe. A view that was confirmed by a decisive yes in a referendum. After joining, however, the country quickly became more pragmatic about its membership. Multiple studies show how political parties shifted their focus from the symbolism of returning to Europe towards specific EU policies, funds, and regulations. Eurosceptic rhetoric, often driven by political convenience, became more common. This contributes to lower levels of trust in EU institutions and lower approval ratings of the EU as a whole compared to the EU average. But while this skepticism was always present, there never were any serious discussions about leaving the Union. Scholars describe this stance as critical Europeanism, accepting membership as necessary and beneficial while remaining wary of deeper integration. Recent political developments reinforce this picture. Andrej Babiš's ANO movement, often labeled Eurosceptic, won the latest parliamentary elections by a wide margin, yet Babiš continues to insist his party is pro-European. Meanwhile, the fact that strongly pro-EU and pro-NATO President Petr Pavel was elected earlier and continues to enjoy high approval ratings suggests that many voters want a firm Western orientation. Furthermore, debates about the EU rarely address long-term visions. Instead, they mostly focus on specific issues like climate policy, migration, and defense. Now on to the Netherlands, which was one of the 6 founding members of the ECSC. In the early years, European integration was largely technocratic, driven by political and economic elites rather than public debate. Nonetheless, the Netherlands supported cooperation enthusiastically, reflecting its international orientation and dependence on trade. Today, Dutch public support for EU membership is among the highest in Europe. Eurobarometer surveys show that 85% of Dutch respondents believe the country benefits from EU membership. They value the EU's contribution to international cooperation, peace, and security, and a majority supports a stronger EU role in addressing crises. Most Dutch citizens are also open to further enlargement. However, their support is not unconditional. In 2016, for example, the Dutch citizens voted no in a referendum that asked whether the EU should sign an association agreement with Ukraine. Many feel distant from EU decision-making and believe the Union benefits large companies and political elites more than ordinary citizens. And identification with Europe remains relatively weak. Dutch support is therefore highly pragmatic. The EU is valued for concrete benefits rather than emotional or ideological attachment. This became clear with the rejection of a European constitution in 2005, when Dutch and French citizens voted against the constitution in referendums. In present politics, pro-EU positions dominate mainstream parties, while right-wing populist parties such as PVV and FVD strongly criticize EU regulation, migration policy, and perceived intrusions on national sovereignty. Eurosceptic parties combined currently make up about 30% of the parliament. The PVV is the biggest Eurosceptic party in the Netherlands, and it has long advocated for an exit. Recently, however, the party came to the realization that this stance was unpopular even among its own voter base, moving the party towards a milder but nonetheless skeptical position. As a result, public debates on the EU in the Netherlands can be polarized, even though overall support for membership remains stable. So we can say that skepticism exists in both older Western and newer Central and Eastern member states, but there is also consistent and broad support for the EU in both. The support does come from different historical experiences, though. To summarize our case studies, the Netherlands, shaped by decades of integration, tends to view the EU as part of its normal international orientation, a stable framework enabling trade, security, and effective regulation. Czechia, meanwhile, and other post-2004 states originally associated membership with reintegration and modernization, but this early symbolism has evolved into a more cautious, performance-focused assessment. In both countries, support has become pragmatic. Dutch citizens value the EU for the concrete benefits it provides, while Czech citizens acknowledge similar benefits but remain more attentive to issues of fairness and responsiveness. Importantly, despite those differences, both types of member states now often treat the EU less as an abstract ideal and more as a toolbox, assessing the Union by how well it works, not by how it was imagined. This convergence matters for the EU's future, as long as EU institutions deliver reliable benefits such as economic stability, security cooperation, mobility and common standards, support can remain stable, even if deeper enthusiasm or identification remains elusive. However, this also means that disillusion, meaning when institutions are perceived as failing, unresponsive, or biased, can strike across the board. In founding states, skepticism may come from debates about democracy, over-regulation, or national sovereignty. In newer states, from unmet expectations or disappointments with inequality or corruption. That is not to say that over-regulation and national sovereignty are of no concern in Czechia. Especially among more Eurosceptic voters, there is often a sense of policies being forced upon their country by Western member states. And reversely, the Dutch are very aware of the fact that their country is a net contributor to the EU, meaning that they spend more on European integration than they receive in subsidies. In that sense, long membership does not guarantee blind loyalty, but it does tend to produce a more steady, pragmatic baseline. In other words, the EU has won the minds of these citizens, but not yet the hearts. Overall, the divide between old versus new does remain visible in the motivations behind EU support. But in practice, attitudes are converging. Both founding and newer member states increasingly view the EU as a functional framework rather than a value-driven community. What matters now is performance and perceived fairness, not origin or length of membership. Even though many member states now approach the EU in pragmatic terms, this trajectory is not fixed. Public attitudes evolve, and the character of European integration is shaped by those who participate in it. If citizens choose to engage, debate, and advocate for a more value-driven union, the EU can again become an ideational project grounded in shared purpose, democratic responsibility, and long-term vision. The direction the EU takes depends on whether people are willing to shape that conversation rather than leave it to political elites. Everyone has a role in defining what Europe means. Staying informed, voting in European elections, challenging misinformation, and speaking up in local or national debates all help move the Union toward the future its citizens want. So whether you are Czech, Dutch, or from someplace else, remember this. A more principled, ambitious EU is possible if enough people insist on it. Subscribe to the Volt There YouTube channel for more explainer videos and share this video with someone who needs to see this. And remember, the story of democracy isn't finished.